Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down a complex and pretty provocative theory from our source documents, one that connects two of history's most iconic disasters, arguing one was actually a deliberate blueprint for the other.
So let's just dive right in. The source material kicks off its case by pointing to this quote. It's from a think tank called the Project for the New American Century, whose members included future top officials like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. And get this, it was published in September of 2000, exactly 1 year before the event it seems to be describing.
Now, the documents we're looking at present what they call a Gnostic indictment. And the central idea here is that the events of September 11th were not a surprise attack at all, but a totally staged event, a meticulously planned psychological operation with a very specific and hidden purpose.
Okay, so to really get our heads around this theory, we're going to walk through their entire case file, step by step. We'll start with the new Titanic indictment, then look at the original Titanic as the so-called blueprint, run through a forensic audit of 9/11, follow the money trail, examine the physics of the collapse, and finally, look at what they call the harvest. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Before even getting to 9/11, the source material says, hold on, you can't understand 2001 until you understand 1912. It argues we first have to look at the alleged blueprint, the sinking of the original Titanic. According to this text, the sinking of the Titanic was no accident. It presents the disaster as a precisely coordinated hit job. The goal? To eliminate three of the wealthiest men in the world: Astor, Guggenheim, and Strauss. And the motive? All three were the biggest and most powerful opponents of creating the Federal Reserve.
And here's the core parallel the source makes. It's like a then and now. On the left, the Titanic clears the path for a new private central bank. On the right, 9/11 clears the path for endless war and the mass surveillance state. The method, they argue, is identical. You use a sacrificial vessel, first the ship, then towers, and the mass casualties serve as the perfect cover story to achieve a massive political and financial goal.
The documents lay out what they call a three-step playbook. First, an alleged insurance scam where the Titanic's damaged sister ship was secretly swapped in its place. Second, deliberate sabotage. They took away the binoculars, the ship had a fire burning in its hull, and they steered it full speed into an ice field they already knew about. And third, a rescue ship that was nearby was ordered to stand down. This playbook, the source claims, was just refined and used again decades later. All right, so with that alleged blueprint in mind, now we turn to the core of the source's argument, its forensic audit of September 11th. And according to this indictment, the very first step in that audit is to follow the money. You know how they say in any investigation, you've got to follow the money? Well, the source argues the real nature of the 9/11 operation is revealed by doing just that, by auditing the flow of capital and, maybe more importantly, the strategic destruction of financial evidence. So get this. On September 10th, 2001, the day before the attacks, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, holds a press conference, and he makes his absolutely jaw-dropping admission that the Pentagon cannot track or account for $2.3 trillion in transactions, a story that, of course, was completely wiped off the map by the next morning's news. The source argues that the specific impact locations were anything but random. The section of the Pentagon that got hit happened to be the one housing the very budget analysts and accounting offices that were investigating those missing trillions. At the same time, the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7 later that day conveniently destroyed thousands of SEC case files on major Wall Street fraud investigations. Poof, gone. And then there's the stock market. The text points to a huge, statistically impossible surge in what are called put options. Basically, financial bets that a stock is about to crash. These bets were placed on the exact two airlines involved. At the same time, there was a massive spike in call options, bets the stock will rise, on major defense contractors. The source claims this is a smoking gun for insider trading based on precise foreknowledge of what was about to happen. Okay, so we've followed the money. Now we turn to the physical evidence. And the claim here is pretty stark, that the structural failures of three separate skyscrapers that day simply defy the official explanation and, well, the laws of physics.
But even before the collapses, there's the question of why the planes were never intercepted. The source claims this was a deliberate stand-down, not incompetence. Why? Because on that exact morning, NORAD was running multiple military exercises simulating the precise scenario of hijacked planes being used as weapons. This allegedly flooded radar screens with false blips, completely paralyzing air traffic controllers, who were recorded asking, "Is this real world or exercise?"
Which brings us to the absolute centerpiece of the physical indictment, World Trade Center Building 7. This was a 47-story tower. It was not hit by a plane. It had some scattered office fires. And yet late that afternoon, it collapsed perfectly, symmetrically, and at the speed of gravity, straight down into its own footprint.
To support the theory of controlled demolition for all three towers, the source points to three key pieces of forensic evidence. First, freefall acceleration, which they claim is only possible if all the floors below are removed at the same time. Second, video evidence shows what look like squibs, puffs of smoke shooting horizontally out of the buildings far below the collapse point. And third, the alleged discovery of unreacted military-grade nanothermite in dust samples from ground zero.
And then there's what this source calls a catastrophic script error. Over in London, a BBC reporter announced the collapse of Building 7 live on air while the building itself was still visibly standing in the shot right behind her. The source presents this as proof that major media outlets were working from a pre-written narrative, and the demolitions simply ran a little behind schedule.
So, if all that's true, what was the point? According to the text, the destruction in New York and Washington wasn't the end goal at all. It was just the catalyst. The real purpose, it claims, was the pre-planned geopolitical harvest that followed. As proof, the source presents this on-air statement from General Wesley Clark, a former NATO Supreme Allied commander. Clark said that shortly after 9/11, he was shown a memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that laid out a plan to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And the kicker is, none of them had any connection to the attacks. The plan already existed, it just needed a justification.
And finally, on the domestic front, the text argues 9/11 provided the shock and awe needed to pass the Patriot Act. This massive, complex bill was presented to Congress just days after the attacks, which suggests it was pre-written and just sitting on a shelf, waiting for the right crisis to justify the modern surveillance state.
This brings us to the most, esoteric claim in the indictment. What this source says is the ultimate why. It introduces this concept called Ambrosia Loosh, which it defines as the psychic energy generated by human trauma. The claim is that the event was designed to be broadcast globally to harvest this energy on an unprecedented scale. So, to put their biggest claim simply, the event was engineered to be more than just a geopolitical catalyst. They say it was a symbolic and psychological mega-ritual designed to traumatize the collective consciousness, lock the entire planet into a new, lower frequency of fear, and kick off an era of much tighter control. So when you look at it this way, the source presents the event not as a single act, but as a sophisticated operation with multiple layers of objectives. Geopolitical, to kickstart endless war, financial, to cover up trillions in fraud, and esoteric, to conduct a planetary-scale harvest of trauma. And the source material leaves us with this final, and frankly, pretty unsettling thought. It urges us to analyze world events not as random things that happen, but as potential steps in a larger hidden agenda, asking, if this playbook is real, what might the next new Titanic look like?